"Ma'am, you need to move. This seat isn't for people like you." The words sliced clean through the quiet hum of the first-class cabin, sharp enough to turn heads before the plane had even pushed back from the gate. Amanda Whitmore didn't lower her voice when she said it. She didn't need to. Her tone carried the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned, the kind that assumed agreement before it was earned. Standing in the aisle of Flight 247 from Chicago to Los Angeles, dressed in a tailored ivory blazer and holding a glass of pre-boarding champagne, she reached down without hesitation and lifted a black leather bag from seat 2A, letting it drop onto the carpeted floor with a soft but deliberate thud. The sound wasn't loud, but the message was. That seat was hers now. Darius Cole, seated just inches away, didn't move right away. He didn't reach for the bag. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Amanda at first. Instead, he sat still, hands resting calmly on his knees, eyes forward, as if the moment hadn't fully arrived yet. Around him, the cabin shifted. A few passengers glanced up from their phones. A man across the aisle leaned slightly into the space, curiosity pulling him in. A flight attendant near the galley paused mid-step, watching, waiting, calculating. Amanda let out a small, impatient laugh, the kind meant for an audience. "Did you not hear me?" she said, louder now, her voice brushing against every row in first class. "You're in the wrong seat." Only then did Darius turn his head. Slowly, measured. His gaze landed on the bag at his feet before lifting to meet hers, steady and unreadable. He didn't rush. He didn't react the way she expected. And that, more than anything, unsettled her for just a fraction of a second. But she covered it quickly, straightening her posture, reclaiming the moment. "This is first class," she added, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "Seat 2A. You need to move." The flight attendant stepped closer now, drawn in by the tension tightening the air. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone polite, but already leaning toward resolution. Amanda answered before Darius could speak. "Yes," she said, gesturing toward him without even looking. "He's in my seat." The attendant nodded slightly, eyes flicking to Darius, scanning him the way people do when they think they already know the answer. Simple black t-shirt, dark jeans, no visible status symbols, no signals that matched the expectations of this space. "Sir," she said, carefully neutral, "may I see your boarding pass?" Darius didn't reach for it yet. Instead, he glanced once more at his bag on the floor, then back at Amanda, then finally at the attendant. The cabin had gone quieter now, the kind of quiet that builds when something is about to tip in one direction or another. A man in row 3 lowered his newspaper. A woman near the window subtly angled her phone. No one spoke, but everyone was listening. Amanda exhaled sharply, already impatient with the delay. "We don't have time for this," she said, stepping slightly closer into his space, as if proximity alone could force compliance. "Just move." But Darius didn't move. Not an inch. And in that stillness, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to suggest that this moment wasn't going to unfold the way anyone in that cabin expected. The flight attendant hesitated for half a second longer than she should have, and in that small delay the balance of the moment began to tilt in a direction no one had planned, because Darius Cole still had not reached for his boarding pass, and still had not bent down to pick up his bag, and that silence, controlled and deliberate, started to feel less like confusion and more like intention, the kind of intention that made people uncomfortable without understanding why, and Amanda noticed it, too, even if she refused to acknowledge it, shifting her weight slightly in the aisle, her grip tightening around the stem of her glass as if holding onto something solid would keep the narrative from slipping away. "I do not know why this is even a conversation," she said, her voice edged now, thinner, sharper. "He is clearly not supposed to be here." And the attendant nodded again, this time more firmly, stepping closer, her training pulling her toward resolution, toward order, toward restoring what looked like a disruption. "Sir, I am going to need to see your boarding pass now," she repeated, her tone polite, but no longer neutral, and Darius finally moved, but not in the way anyone expected, because instead of immediately complying, he leaned forward slightly, reaching not for his pocket but for his bag on the floor, lifting it calmly, brushing off an invisible speck of dust with the back of his hand, as if reclaiming something more than just leather, then placing it back on the seat beside him with quiet precision, the kind of movement that said this space still belonged to him, whether anyone agreed or not. And only after that did he reach into his pocket and pull out a folded boarding pass, holding it between two fingers without yet handing it over, his eyes meeting the attendant's with a steadiness that did not ask for permission. And for a brief moment the attendant's expression flickered, something uncertain passing behind her professional composure. But Amanda cut through it before it could grow. "You see what I mean," she said, gesturing again, louder now, drawing the attention of more passengers. "This is exactly what happens when people try to sit where they do not belong." And a low murmur rippled through the cabin, not loud enough to form words but strong enough to be felt. A current of observation moving row by row, while a young flight attendant near the galley, barely out of training, watched with a crease forming between her brows, her eyes darting from Darius to the boarding pass in his hand, as if something about the scene was not aligning the way it should, and the lead attendant extended her hand expectantly. "Sir," she said again, this time with a firmer edge, and Darius finally placed the boarding pass into her palm, his movements unhurried, his posture unchanged, as if time itself moved differently around him. And as she glanced down at it, the world seemed to narrow for just a second, her eyes scanning the printed name, the seat number, the confirmation code, everything exactly where it should be, everything exactly as it should read. And yet the tension in the aisle did not dissolve, because Amanda was already speaking again before the attendant could process what she was seeing. "Well," she said, crossing her arms now, "I am sure that can be sorted out, but I am not standing here all day." And she turned slightly toward the front of the cabin, as if expecting the situation to resolve in her favor by default, while the attendant looked back up, her grip on the boarding pass tightening, just slightly, caught between what was in her hand and what was being asserted in front of her, and behind them. The quiet observer near the galley took a small step forward, her voice low but present. "I think I saw his ticket scan earlier," she said, almost to herself but loud enough to be heard. And for the first time, the certainty in the aisle cracked just enough to let doubt in. The words from the junior attendant did not land loudly, but they landed deep, cutting through the noise in a way Amanda could not immediately control. And for the first time the rhythm of the moment broke just slightly, because doubt, once introduced, does not need volume to spread, it only needs space. And now there was space, visible in the way the lead attendant's eyes flicked back down to the boarding pass in her hand, then up again to Darius, then briefly toward Amanda, as if recalculating something she had already decided. "You saw it scan?" she asked quietly, her voice no longer carrying the same certainty, and the younger attendant nodded, stepping forward just enough to be seen but not enough to challenge authority directly. "Yes, ma'am," she said, choosing her words carefully. It showed green at the gate, seat 2A, and the cabin shifted again, more noticeably this time, because people were no longer just watching, they were processing, connecting details, evaluating what they had assumed seconds earlier, and Amanda felt it slipping. The narrative she had taken control of beginning to loosen in her hands, so she moved quickly to tighten it, letting out a short, dismissive laugh. "Gate scans are not always accurate," she said, her tone sharper now, more defensive than before. "People switch seats all the time. It happens." And she turned her gaze directly at the lead attendant, pressing the point, "You know that." But the attendant did not respond immediately, because now there was something else in the air, something heavier than assumption, something closer to scrutiny, and Darius remained exactly where he was, seated, composed, watching the exchange unfold without interruption, his presence no longer passive but quietly dominant, like a weight that did not need to move to be felt. And that stillness began to influence the room in ways no one could fully explain, because even those who had initially sided with Amanda were now hesitating, their confidence replaced by a cautious silence, while across the aisle, the man who had lowered his newspaper earlier leaned forward slightly and spoke just loud enough to be heard. "If his ticket scanned and the seat matches, then what is the issue?" And the question hung there, simple and direct, forcing the moment into a space where it could not rely on tone alone, and Amanda's jaw tightened, her control slipping further. "The issue," she said, each word more deliberate than the last, is that this does not look right. And the phrase lingered longer than she intended, because once spoken out loud, it exposed more than it clarified, and the younger attendant's eyes widened just slightly, recognizing what had just been revealed without needing it to be explained, while the lead attendant straightened her posture, her grip on the boarding pass shifting as if it now carried more weight than paper should. "Sir," she said, turning back to Darius, her voice measured but different now. "Can you please confirm your full name for me?" And Darius met her gaze without hesitation, his voice calm, even, unmistakably steady. "Darius Cole," he said, and the name did not echo through the cabin the way a shout would have, but it moved just as quickly, passing from one passenger to another, landing in places where recognition began to stir, faint at first, then growing, because some names do not need introduction. They only need to be heard in the right moment. And as the attendant looked back down at the boarding pass again, her expression shifted in a way that could not be hidden this time. The first clear sign that something in this situation was no longer what it had appeared to be, and standing in the aisle, Amanda Whitmore felt it, even before she understood it, the quiet, irreversible turn of a moment she no longer controlled. The name did not echo loudly, but it moved through the cabin like a quiet current, and for those who recognized it, everything shifted at once, while for those who did not, the change was still visible in the reactions of others, in the way the lead attendant's posture tightened just slightly, in the way her eyes lingered on the boarding pass a second longer than before, as if confirming something she already suspected but did not want to say out loud yet, and Amanda noticed that hesitation immediately, her instincts sharp enough to sense when control was slipping. So she stepped forward again, reclaiming space with practiced confidence. "I do not care what name is on that ticket," she said, her voice cutting across the growing tension. "This is my seat, and I am not standing here while this gets debated." And she reached for the call button above the row, pressing it with a firm click that sounded louder than it should have, a signal not just for assistance but for authority. And within seconds another senior flight attendant approached from the front of the cabin, older, more composed, the kind of presence that usually settled situations before they escalated. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked, her tone calm but commanding. And Amanda turned toward her immediately, relief flashing across her face as if reinforcement had arrived. "He is refusing to give up my seat," she said, gesturing again without looking at Darius. "And now we are being told his ticket is somehow valid, which clearly makes no sense." And the senior attendant took the boarding pass from her colleague, scanning it quickly, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she read the details, then lifting her gaze to Darius with a look that was no longer dismissive, but searching. "Sir, have there been any changes to your reservation that you are aware of?" she asked, carefully, choosing a question that allowed for correction without confrontation, but Darius did not answer immediately, because the moment had already moved beyond simple clarification, and instead he reached into his pocket once more, this time pulling out his phone, unlocking it with a single motion, his expression unchanged, and the act itself drew attention, subtle but unmistakable, because it suggested preparation, not reaction. While behind him the younger attendant spoke again, more firmly now, her voice gaining strength from what she had already said. "I remember the name," she said, stepping closer. "It stood out when I checked the pre-boarding list this morning." And the senior attendant glanced at her briefly, then back at the phone in Darius's hand, as if pieces were beginning to align in a way that could no longer be ignored. But Amanda let out a sharp breath, her patience thinning. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw even more attention from the surrounding rows. "You are holding up boarding for one person who clearly does not belong in this section." And the words landed heavier this time, not because they were louder, but because now they were being heard differently, filtered through doubt instead of assumption. And across the aisle, the man who had spoken earlier leaned back slightly, shaking his head under his breath, while a woman 2 rows behind lifted her phone just a little higher, capturing the unfolding moment. And Darius finally spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying without effort. "You are not delayed because of me," he said, his eyes moving briefly from Amanda to the senior attendant. "You are delayed because no one here wants to verify what is already true." And the sentence settled into the cabin with a weight that shifted everything just a little further, because it was not defensive, it was not emotional, it was precise. And for the first time since this began, the authority in the aisle did not feel singular. It felt divided, uncertain, and in that uncertainty, the situation moved closer to something none of them had planned for. The air in the cabin no longer felt like a routine delay. It felt charged, as if every second stretched just a little longer than it should, and the balance of control that Amanda had held so confidently at the beginning was now visibly unstable, slipping in small, undeniable ways, and she could feel it in the silence around her, in the way fewer people were nodding along, in the way the senior attendant had not immediately sided with her, in the way Darius Cole remained completely still, completely composed, as if none of this required urgency on his part, and that calm began to press against her, forcing her to act again. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice sharper now, no longer smooth but edged with frustration. "You are letting him stall instead of resolving this." And she turned directly to the senior attendant, lowering her voice slightly but intensifying it. "Either he moves, or I will be filing a formal complaint before this plane even leaves the ground." And the words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were familiar, the language of pressure that usually worked, the kind that pushed decisions in her favor without needing evidence. And for a moment, it almost did, because the senior attendant straightened, her expression tightening as she considered the implications, the delay, the report, the disruption to schedule, and she looked back at Darius, her tone shifting toward finality. "Sir, we need to resolve this now," she said. "If there is any confusion, we can assist you in finding another seat." And there it was, the pivot, subtle but clear, the assumption sliding back into place, and a quiet ripple of discomfort moved through the cabin, because even those watching could feel that something about that resolution did not sit right, and Darius noticed it too, not in the way people shifted or glanced, but in the way the room itself seemed to lean, waiting, and for the first time since this began, he leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze drifting past the attendants for just a second, not distracted, but distant, as if something older had surfaced beneath the present moment, something familiar, and in that brief pause, the memory came, not as a flash of chaos, but as a quiet, sharp image. 20 years earlier, a smaller airport, a younger version of himself standing at a gate in a pressed shirt and borrowed confidence, holding a ticket he had worked weeks to afford, only to be told, calmly, politely, that there had been a mistake, that his seat had been reassigned, that he would need to step aside, and the words had been softer then, more careful, but the meaning had been the same. "You do not belong here," and he had stepped aside that day, not because it was right, but because he had no leverage to challenge it, no system to call, no authority to invoke, just a quiet understanding that this was how the world operated when it decided who fit and who did not. And now, sitting in seat 2A, decades later, that same tone, that same assumption, had returned, dressed differently but carrying the same weight, and Darius exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, not louder, not sharper, but deeper, anchored in something far beyond the moment. "You have already decided what the truth is," he said, looking directly at the senior attendant, before verifying any part of it, and the words did not accuse, they exposed, and that made them harder to ignore, while the younger attendant shifted beside them, her discomfort now visible, her voice quieter but firm. "We should check the system again," she said, glancing toward the front of the cabin, "just to be sure." And Amanda let out a sharp breath, almost a scoff. "There is nothing to check," she said, but this time, the certainty in her voice did not land the same way, because the room had already begun to change, and somewhere beneath the tension, the first real crack had formed, not in policy, not in procedure, but in belief. The hesitation in the cabin was no longer subtle. It had become visible, tangible, something people could feel pressing against their decisions, and the senior attendant knew it, even if she had not yet fully admitted it to herself, because the moment had moved beyond a simple seating dispute and into something else entirely, something that carried weight beyond policy, beyond procedure. And Darius Cole could see that shift clearly, not because anyone said it out loud, but because the energy in The room had changed direction, no longer pushing him out, but pulling toward him, waiting, and that was when he moved again, not abruptly, not reactively, but with quiet intention, lifting his phone slightly, his thumb moving across the screen with practiced ease, and he did not announce what he was doing. He did not explain. He simply acted, and that action alone drew attention, because it was not defensive, it was decisive. And the senior attendant noticed it immediately, her eyes narrowing. Just slightly. "Sir, what are you doing?" she asked, her tone controlled but cautious now, and Darius did not look up right away. "Finishing the motion before responding. Resolving the confusion," he said, his voice calm, almost effortless, and somewhere near the front of the cabin, a faint chime sounded, subtle but distinct, followed by a brief pause that no one could explain yet, and Amanda crossed her arms tighter, her patience thinning into irritation. "Oh, please," she said, letting out a short, dismissive breath. "You think making a phone call is going to change anything?" But her words did not land the way they had before, because now they sounded less like certainty and more like resistance, and the younger attendant stepped back slightly, her eyes flicking toward the cockpit door as if she sensed something shifting beyond what she could see. Wow. The senior attendant straightened, her posture tightening again, but this time not out of control, out of anticipation, and Darius finally lifted his gaze, not toward Amanda, not toward the crowd, but directly at the senior attendant. "You asked to resolve this," he said, his tone even, measured. "So let us resolve it correctly." And there was no challenge in his voice, no raised edge, just a quiet authority that did not need reinforcement. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the cabin itself seemed to pause, suspended between what had been assumed and what was about to be confirmed. And then, from the front of the aircraft, the cockpit door opened slightly, just enough for a uniformed pilot to step into view, his expression focused, his eyes scanning the cabin with purpose, and the shift was immediate, because pilots did not leave the cockpit during boarding without reason. And every crew member in the aisle felt it at once, the subtle but unmistakable change in hierarchy. As the pilot stepped forward, his gaze landing first on the senior attendant, then moving to Darius, then briefly to Amanda, as if assessing the entire scene in a single glance, and the senior attendant spoke first, her voice lower now, more careful. "Captain, we are handling a seating discrepancy," she said. But the captain did not respond right away, because his attention had already fixed on Darius Cole, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to be seen, enough to be felt, a recognition forming that had nothing to do with guesswork. And in that moment, Amanda Whitmore felt it again, that same shift she had sensed earlier, only stronger now, deeper, as if the ground beneath her certainty had just moved, and for the first time since she had spoken, she did not immediately follow with another statement, because something in the room had already begun to answer for itself. The captain did not raise his voice, he did not rush, and he did not look confused, which in itself said more than any announcement could have, because confusion would have kept the moment uncertain, but recognition changed everything. And as he stepped fully into the aisle, the authority in the cabin shifted in a way no one could ignore. The senior attendant straightened instinctively, the younger one stepped back, and even the quiet observers felt it. That subtle but undeniable realignment of power. "Captain," the senior attendant began again, more carefully this time. "We are dealing with a seating issue in first class." But the captain lifted a hand slightly, not dismissive, just enough to pause her words, his eyes still fixed on Darius Cole, and for a brief second, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something that had not yet been spoken but was already understood. And then the captain spoke, his tone calm but precise. "Mr. Cole," he said, not as a question, but as confirmation, and the name landed differently this time. Heavier, clearer, unmistakable, and Darius inclined his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. "Captain," he replied, and that exchange, simple as it was, broke whatever illusion had been holding the situation together, because now it was no longer about a disputed seat. It was about something far larger, something that had been present from the beginning but hidden beneath. Assumption, and Amanda felt it immediately, the sharp drop in certainty, the way the room no longer moved with her but around her, and she tried to recover, stepping forward again, her voice tighter now, less fluid. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the captain directly. "This is my seat, and I have been waiting for this to be handled properly." But the captain turned to her only briefly, his expression professional but distant, the kind of distance reserved for situations already understood. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "we are handling it." And then his attention returned to Darius, and in that moment, the hierarchy became visible to everyone in the cabin, not through titles or announcements, but through focus, through who was being addressed and who was not. And Darius stood slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the kind of control that made the movement feel inevitable rather than reactive, his presence rising into the space without forcing it. And when he spoke, his voice did not need volume to carry. It reached every row because the room was already listening. "I did not board this flight to argue over a seat," he said, his gaze moving briefly across the attendants before settling again. "I boarded to see how your airline treats people when it thinks no one important is watching." And the words settled into the cabin like a weight that shifted everything at once, because they reframed the entire moment, turning what had seemed like a disruption into something deliberate, something observed, something measured, and the captain's posture adjusted slightly, not defensive, but attentive, as if understanding the full scope of what was now being revealed. And Amanda's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to show the first real fracture. Confusion mixing with realization as the pieces began to align in a way she had not anticipated, and Darius continued, his tone steady, unhurried. "You question my presence," he said, looking briefly toward Amanda, then back to the crew. "You assumed I did not belong, and you were ready to move me without verifying a single fact." And no one interrupted him, because there was nothing to interrupt, the truth of it already evident in the silence that followed. And then he said it, not as a declaration, not as a performance, but as a simple statement that carried more weight than anything spoken. "Before, the seat you were trying to take," he said, his voice even, "is on a plane I own." And the words did not echo, they did not need to, because the impact was immediate, visible in the way the senior attendant's expression froze, in the way the younger attendant's eyes widened, in the way the captain's gaze sharpened with full recognition, and in the way Amanda Whitmore stood completely still for the first time since this began. The certainty she had carried from the moment she stepped into the aisle now gone, replaced by something she could not control, something she could not speak her way out of, because the room had already changed, and this time, it was not shifting back. The silence that followed did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, piece by piece, as the weight of what had just been said settled into every corner of the cabin. And no one moved immediately, because there was nowhere to move to, no version of the moment that could return to what it had been just seconds before, and the senior attendant was the first to react, though even that reaction came carefully, her posture straightening not out of authority but out of recognition, her voice lower. Now, controlled in a different way. "Mr. Cole," she said, the name no longer uncertain. "I was not aware," but the sentence did not finish, because awareness was no longer the issue, and the captain stepped forward half a pace, his presence now fully aligned with Darius, not opposing him, not questioning him, but acknowledging him in a way that made the hierarchy unmistakable. "We will correct this immediately," he said, his tone firm but respectful, and he turned slightly toward the crew, the shift subtle but decisive. "Restore the seating record for 2A and confirm all logs." And the words moved faster than before, because now there was no hesitation left in the system, only response, and the younger attendant moved quickly toward the front console, her hands steady despite the tension, while the senior attendant stepped aside, physically clearing space in the aisle that had once been contested. And in that movement alone, the entire situation reversed, because what had been a question was now an answer, what had been doubt was now confirmation. And Amanda Whitmore stood in the center of it, the only one who had not moved. Not yet, her posture stiff, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and calculation, as if searching for a version of events that would restore her footing. This does not make sense," she said finally, her voice quieter now, the edge gone, replaced by something uncertain, and for the first time, no one responded to her immediately, because the room had already shifted past her narrative, and the younger attendant looked back from the console, her voice clear, almost careful. The system shows full ownership access under his profile, she said, glancing briefly at the captain. Seat 2A is confirmed and locked. And that was it. The final piece, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. And the captain nodded once, then turned fully toward Darius, his tone measured, respectful in a way that needed no explanation. We apologize for the oversight, he said. And the word oversight carried more weight than apology, because it acknowledged failure without needing to describe it. And around them, the passengers began to shift again. But this time the movement was different, lighter, almost relieved, as if a tension they had not realized they were holding had finally released, and a few quiet murmurs rose, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to mark the change. While across the aisle, the man who had questioned earlier gave a small nod, as if confirming something he had already suspected, and the woman behind him lowered her phone slightly, her expression no longer tense but resolved. And Darius remained standing for a moment longer, not to assert dominance, not to prolong the moment, but to let it settle fully, to let every piece of it land exactly where it needed to, before he spoke again, his voice calm, even, carrying without effort. This was never about a seat, he said, his gaze moving briefly across the crew, then to Amanda, then back again. It was about how quickly you decided who deserved to be here. And the words did not accuse. They clarified, and that made them impossible to ignore, and Amanda lowered her eyes for just a second, the first visible sign that the certainty she had carried into the aisle was gone, replaced by something she could not reshape, while the senior attendant stood still, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, no longer directing, no longer deciding, just present in the aftermath of a moment that had revealed more than procedure ever could. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, the cabin was no longer a place of assumption. It had become a place of consequence. The cabin did not return to normal right away, because moments like this do not reset on command. They linger, they settle into people, they reshape the way a space feels even after the conflict has technically ended. And as Darius Cole lowered himself back into seat 2A, the same seat that had been questioned, challenged, nearly taken from him, the difference was undeniable. Not in the leather or the legroom or the quiet hum of the aircraft, but in the way everyone around him now understood exactly who he was and, more importantly, what had just been revealed about themselves. And the crew moved with a new precision, no longer reacting but correcting, the senior attendant stepping forward once more, her voice steady but changed. Mr. Cole, your seat is secured and your belongings are in place, she said, her tone carrying a respect that had not been present before, and Darius gave a small nod, not acknowledging the service, but the shift, while the captain remained nearby for a moment longer than necessary, his presence signaling to the entire cabin that the situation was not just resolved, it was recognized. And then he turned back toward the cockpit, the door closing softly behind him, restoring the structure of the flight but not erasing what had happened. And Amanda Whitmore stood in the aisle still, her posture no longer commanding, her confidence no longer automatic, because there was no script left for her to follow, no tone she could use to regain control of a narrative that had already moved beyond her reach. And after a long second, she stepped back, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet retreat that said more than any apology could have, taking a different seat offered by the crew without protest, without comment, because anything she might have said would have been measured against what she had already shown, and it would not have held. And around them, the passengers settled again, but differently this time. Conversations quieter, glances more thoughtful, as if each person carried a piece of the moment with them, a recognition that this was not rare, not isolated, but something that had simply been exposed instead of ignored. And the younger attendant returned to her position, her expression composed, but her eyes changed, sharper, more aware, as if she had learned something in real time that training alone could not teach. And Darius sat back, his hands resting lightly, his gaze forward once again, the same position he had held at the beginning, but the meaning of that stillness had shifted completely, because now it was not being questioned, it was being understood. And after a brief pause, he spoke one last time, not loudly, not for attention, but clearly enough for those closest to hear, and for the weight of it to carry beyond them. "You did not mistake who I was," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. "You revealed how you treat people when you think it does not matter." And the words settled into the space like a final note, not demanding reaction, not seeking agreement, just leaving the truth where it could not be moved. And as the aircraft doors prepared to close and the routine announcements resumed, the cabin moved forward, but not unchanged, because something had been set in place, something quiet but permanent. And Darius Cole did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to argue. He did not need to prove anything beyond what had already been shown, because in the end, the power was never in the seat, it was in the standard he refused to lower, and the moment the room realized that, everything else had already been decided.